This is a very important graph because I think it shows you very clearly the level of support for education in various countries. And you can see that sort of in the middle there is China, has a fair amount of private education as well as public education, more so than places like Hungary, etc. But, you know, each country does its own thing and has its own investments. What's really fascinating about this slide is that it's changing very, very dramatically. And in fact, if you look at the data, it shows very clearly that China now has more students than the United States. It has the world's largest higher education system. Now, as a percentage of their population, it still doesn't exceed the United States. But are we having more students in China? Absolutely. The other thing that's fascinating about China, and I'm just using them as an example because it's happening in Malaysia, it's happening in Indonesia, it's happening in Africa, it's happening in the Middle East, it's happening all over the world. We're seeing an explosion in the investment of these countries in education. And education is very empowering. Very empowering. To the point where in China, they're anticipating that the number of universities is going to double over the next 10 years. Can you imagine doubling the size of the U.S. education, higher education system in 10 years? Just sort of blows you away. That's really kind of phenomenal growth. And yet it is clearly growth that is going to have a fairly dramatic impact across the board. And in places like India, they're not even looking at deploying technology and having campuses. They're using distant learning as an example. Now, if you take higher education and you shift it from the developing countries, which have about 10% of their population that gets a higher education degree, versus the United States, which is about 50%, or Europe 50%, we're roughly in that neighborhood. And you apply that statistic to the 4 billion people that live in the developing world, and you just say, well, they're not going to get to 50%. They're going to get to 35%. What that means is that we're going to have 150 million additional students doing knowledge work around the world at 1/10 to 1/5 of the cost of the same work in the United States. Contemplate that for a moment, because it's a challenge. And I think, I don't think it's bad. It's going to happen. It's already happening. It's happening in other industries. I'm going to show you some data here that shows very clearly it's happening in parts of the healthcare industry as well.